I'm Bob Blum, and I am the director of the Johns Hopkins Urban Health Institute. And it's a tremendous pleasure for me to welcome you to this conversation with Antero Pietila and a launch of his new book, The Ghosts of Johns Hopkins. My job is both pleasant and simple. Half of it has already been accomplished by welcoming you here, and the other half is to introduce the moderator for today, Richard Lofton. So Richard Lofton has recently joined the Urban Health Institute as an associate director. He's an assistant professor in the School of Education and the Social Organization of Schools. He's a co-PI for the National Evaluation of the Student Success Mentoring Initiative, and he works in and has a deep commitment to Baltimore. He has been here for about 3 years. His work is primarily in West Baltimore. We hope to broaden his horizons to be a bit more geographically inclusive to East Baltimore as well, but we'll take one step at a time, Richard. Professor Lofton graduated from Columbia University Teachers College in 2014 with his PhD, got a master's degree at the University of Utah, did his undergraduate degree at San Jose University, and we are absolutely thrilled to have you here at Johns Hopkins, and thank you for accepting the invitation to moderate the panel today. Let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. How's everyone doing? We're good? All right. Well, I'm actually really excited to be here, and I'm extremely grateful to be here on this holiday week. And I figured out that I'm actually not the first choice. So Bob and Amy, we have some talking to do, all right? But that's okay. We'll keep moving. So I first would like to introduce you to Antero Pietila. Pietila worked at the Baltimore Sun for 35 years as a local reporter, correspondent in South Africa and the Soviet Union, as a member of the editorial board. He also co-authored an ebook called Race Goes to War, Ollie Stewart and the Reporting of Black Correspondents in World War II, and wrote 2 books, Not in My Neighborhood, How Bigotry Shaped a Great American City, and his new book, The Ghosts of Johns Hopkins. Antero Pietila was born in Helsinki, Finland, and he is the eldest son of a Lutheran pastor. He graduated from the School of Social Sciences in Tampere and earned his Master's of Art at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Please, everyone, let us welcome Antero Pietila.
Thank you very much, Professor Lofton, and good afternoon. My thanks to Dr. Blum and the Johns Hopkins Urban Health Institute for hosting this event. I am honored. Johns Hopkins' lifespan of 78 years covered the Industrial Revolution, the British bombardment of Fort McHenry in 1814, America's westward movement, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. He was a merchant, banker, and venture capitalist, a principal owner of the nation's first common carrier, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company. He was one of the country's richest men, yet his first name still produces a fair amount of confusion. It is Johns, not John, and honors his great-grandmother, whose family name was Johns. The spirit of Johns Hopkins lives on. His $7 million bequest to the university and hospital in 1873 was the largest ever made to American education. This weekend, Michael Bloomberg announced a new record donation to education. It too went to Hopkins and amounted to $1.8 billion. My new book aims to explain Johns Hopkins and his legacy, the university and medical institutions, and their place in a mutating city. In covering over 200 years of local history, I want to provide readers with a framework for understanding Baltimore and how it became what it is today. When Johns Hopkins was 37 years old, he contracted cholera. Malaria was rampant and typhus and yellow fever frequent around the basin, today's Inner Harbor, where he was headquartered on a smelly waterfront. In August of 1832, in the middle of heat and wet blanket mugginess, Baltimoreans began turning blue and dying from cholera's attacks of uncontrollable diarrhea, spasmodic vomiting, violent stomach cramps, and hellish convulsions. Within the next 2 months, 853 succumbed to a painful death. The randomness of cholera caused panic, and so did its ability to kill swiftly. A person could be perfectly healthy in the morning and dead in the afternoon. Those able to flee escaped the city, including dozens of unfortunates at the almshouse, where 133 died. That again confirmed the prevailing opinion that cholera was God's punishment for wrongful living. Johns Hopkins was among thousands who fell seriously ill. Like most of the afflicted, he was treated at home. Opiates were legal and a common remedy in those days. His doctors gave him some variation of this noxious cocktail of poisons: mercury chloride and opium, mercury and potassium nitrate, saline mixture, opium and aloes. Quote, if the bowels are constipated, rhubarb should be preferred. If the least lacks, lead and opium, or calomel and opium with rest in bed, one doctor advised. Bloodletting was routine through a surgical incision to a vein. Johns Hopkins may have contracted the disease from eating a tainted peach, apple, or watermelon. That's how people got sick. In a work you may read free of charge on Google Books, the city's consulting physician, Dr. Horatio Gates Jamieson, documented the epidemic. He recounted how a black man sitting on the stoops and spitting watermelon seeds joked that he and a chum were feasting on a mess of cholera. They had a merry old time. Both got sick and died within a day. Watermelon almost killed 3 white teenagers from a respectable family who disobeyed their mother's warning not to eat any. All fruits and vegetables were suspect. That's why a physician, Dr. John Cromwell, astonished friends when he declared that peaches were wholly innocent. To demonstrate this, the 33-year-old University of Maryland alumnus and nephew of Dr. Jamieson bought a peach and ate it. He was dead within a few hours, the only degreed physician to die in the epidemic. Johns Hopkins' brush with death became a life-changing experience. 2 decades after the cholera epidemic, when he retired from his own mercantile businesses to join the B&O Railroad as a full-time executive, he also joined 2 hospital boards, although his own formal education ended at the age of 12. One was Union Protestant Hospital, today's Union Memorial, which was opening a sick room at Baltimore and Stricker Streets. The other one was Maryland Hospital. It was located at Broadway and Old Philadelphia Road, today's Monument Street, and had been created in 1793 by the City Health Department, the oldest such bureaucracy in the nation. Maryland had been designated a cholera hospital, and when it eventually moved to Catonsville to become Spring Grove Mental Hospital, Hopkins bought the Broadway land. This is the site Hopkins occupies today. 4 other hospitals were nearby. What became Sinai was across the street. St. Joseph catered to German Catholics at Caroline and Oliver. Then there was an Episcopalian infirmary at Broadway and Fairmount, a building which, with a cupola now known as the Church Home. Finally, what ultimately became St. Agnes in the southwest corner of the city was located across from Greenmount Cemetery. All those hospitals treated only whites. Johns Hopkins' hospital plans in 1870, 3 years before his death, caused a racial stir. He declared that his charity hospital would treat indigents without regard to sex, age, or color. Irate white neighbors tried to stop his plan. A city councilman told a protest meeting that his constituents did not want a hospital of any kind, and particularly one for the use of colored persons. By contrast, African Americans praised him, quote, "Johns Hopkins will ever be regarded as the friend of the colored race in that we will teach our children to do honor for his memory," read a resolution passed at a mass meeting at the Frederick Douglass Institute near City Hall. When the hospital opened in 1889, 16 years after Hopkins' death, white and black patients shared common wards. Whites soon objected, and first separate wards were built, then separate buildings. The blood bank kept the blood of whites and blacks separate. Johns Hopkins' grandfather and father both owned slaves, but he was an abolitionist who contributed to the cause. Nevertheless, on a daily basis, he interacted with rich and powerful men who were slave owners without that becoming an issue. In the Civil War, he supported Lincoln and Reconstruction, stance that set him apart from Baltimore slave-owning grandees. Beyond that, things are hazy, because no documents detail his views on race. According to Judge J. Thompson Mason, a former U.S. congressman, Hopkins did not deign to confer the right of suffrage on the Negro, nor place him on a footing of social equality with the whites. Nevertheless, said Mason, Hopkins felt that the Negro claims our benevolence and charity. He is a part of the great human family and is entitled to the same mercy and charity as that bestowed on the white man. That such indeed were his views can be gauged from his will. About race at the university, Johns Hopkins said nothing. His attention went to the hospital. He decreed that it be not only for whites, but for the sick, colored people, and also children. He ordered the hospital trustees to establish and administer an asylum for up to 400 black orphans and see to their education. The trustees never operated such home in full compliance with his instructions, and by 1927, the orphans' asylum was gone for good. Nothing replaced it. Hopkins' instructions for hospital design were detailed. He wanted the hospital to look like a breakthrough institution and showcase his legacy. He assumed that the university would be located at Clifton, his 330-acre estate along Harford Road. To provide a focal point, he ordered his trustees to stretch Broadway to Clifton so that a grand boulevard would lead to the hospital. That, of course, never happened. The trustees never liked Clifton, and when the university encountered serious financial difficulties, they sold it to the city. Friends and business associates of Hopkins then donated the old Homewood estate, and it became the university's permanent home. My book consists of 3 parts. The first part, The Pragmatic Opportunist, explores Johns Hopkins' family origins, his Quaker faith, racial beliefs, and how he operated his businesses. It scrutinizes his peculiar role in the Civil War and discusses the challenges his legacy institutions faced. One chapter examines how Baltimore's 7 medical schools at the time acquired cadavers for dissection by their 1,200 students. The chapter title says it all: Doctors Rob Graves. The second part deals with the racial dynamics of modern Baltimore and looks at the role of the first Hopkins president, Daniel Coit Gilman. He was the de facto leader of the city school board that oversaw separate systems for whites and blacks when the city took initial steps toward formal overall segregation in 1899. This started after Democrats regained power in the city and set in motion the first Negro removal under the banner, "This is a white man's city." Hundreds of blacks were evicted from their homes around City Hall in the name of municipal rebuilding, along with the community's most important institutions, schools, churches, the Afro-American newspaper, Masonic halls, and lawyers and doctors' offices. Strivers headed for the west side, where they replaced white Christians and coexisted with Jews. Ordinary folk ended up on the east side, where Hopkins Hospital had opened a decade earlier. That latter movement would push out the Germans, Irish, and Jews, creating the racial dynamics that continue to this day. The third part, pushing out the lumpenproletariat, discusses Hopkins Hospital's crisis after the 1968 riots, when white Bohemians, today known as Czechs, had moved away from the Broadway corridor and the neighborhood had become black. In the middle of menial employees' unionization drive, the hospital and medical school contemplated moving out of East Baltimore altogether. Quote, "A hostile black community constantly reminded of past expansion limits future enlargement of the site," a 1970 assessment stated. "The characteristics of the neighborhood make the area uncongenial for employees, staff, and students." The move never happened. Hopkins could not afford to lose available clinical material from the hood. Instead, it adopted a diversification strategy that led to partnerships and acquisitions of other hospitals. It also diverted routine patients away from the hospital on Broadway so that doctors there could concentrate on medically challenging cases. These are just some highlights. By putting all this and much more on the table, I hope to trigger discussion about the Johns Hopkins institutions, islands of first world excellence in a city that increasingly exhibits third world dysfunctions. And I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pietila. So now I want to just introduce the remaining panelists. I'm so excited to hear from them. The first person I want to introduce is Rebecca Hofberger. She's the founder, director, and principal curator of the American Visionary Art Museum. By the age of 19, she had co-founded her own ballet company, and by 21, was a sought-after consultant to a broad spectrum of nonprofits. At age 25, Hofberger was awarded the title of Dam for her work to establish medical field hospitals in Nigeria. She studied alternative and folk medicine in Mexico. Returning to the States, Hofberger served on the board of the Elizabeth Zuberger Ross Center in Virginia, and she worked as development director at the Sinai Hospital Department of Psychiatry for People Encouraging People. I'd like to introduce you to Rebecca Hofberger. I'm also going to just try to introduce everyone at this time, if it's okay. Also, I want to introduce you to Ronald R. Peterson. Ronald R. Peterson is the President Emeritus of the Johns Hopkins Health System and Special Advisor to the Dean CEO of Johns Hopkins Medicine. Mr. Peterson stepped down on December 31st, 2017, after 44 years of service to Johns Hopkins and 21 years in the dual role of president of the Johns Hopkins Health System and executive vice president of Johns Hopkins Medicine. He was the first person to hold both posts. He also served as the 10th president of the Johns Hopkins Hospital. I also want to introduce you to Deborah Hickman. She is the co-founder, CEO of Sisters Together and Reaching, a faith-based nonprofit community organization that provides spiritual support, direct services, and prevention education to HIV and AIDS infected and affected African American women and men. Reverend Hickman has a Master's of Divinity from Virginia Union University and serves as assistant to the pastor at City Temple of Baltimore Baptist. She is currently appointee on the Mayor's HIV Commission and two-time appointee by the White House Secretary of Health to serve on the Center for Disease and Control and Prevention Health Resources Service Administration Advisory Council. I would like to move on to Graham Mooney. He is an associate professor in the Department of History and of Medicine at the Johns Hopkins University, with appointments in the Department of History and Science and Technology and the Department of Epidemiology and the Bloomberg School of Public Health. His main research interests are in the history of modern public health, infectious diseases, and the historical geographies of health, medicine, and disease. His recent book, Intrusive Interventions, Public Health, Domestic Space, and Infection Disease Surveillance in England, 1840 to 1914, examined the history of public health intervention, such as infectious diseases, notification, institutional and domestic isolation, disinfection, and contact tracing. Mooney is currently working on 2 books projects. So please welcome our guests and our panelists. So should we give you 5 to 7 minutes to kind of respond?
Sounds good.
Okay. Rebecca, would you like to go first?
Is this working fine? Can you hear in the back? Okay, well, this is for you. I wanted to say, if you are passionate about Baltimore City, or if you are brokenhearted about Baltimore City, or if you're invested, either as a homeowner, or you have kids who go to school here, or as a business owner, or as an activist, if you're someone who's thinking about whether you should live here, and how you should negotiate this city, I have to say you have to read this book. I don't get that excited about books because even though I'm a readaholic, there's just too many of them. Everybody seems to have a book these days. And this book, The Ghosts of Johns Hopkins, should be required reading amongst everybody who cares, because Antero has flayed open the DNA of the city, going back actually to revolutionary days. And, it's a very juicy book. It's not a dry history book. I mean, who knew that we birthed the term hookers? That was a big revelation. Turns out Fells Point was called the Hook, and the ladies of the night had a built-in clientele of all the boats coming in. And so that's where that term came from. Also, when I was reading your book, the second chapter, when you talked about doctors who rob graves, you could have called Baltimore Corpses Are Us, because literally, it wasn't just that we were, having people that were stealing graves, corpses from graves for medical research for our own institutions, but they were the primary suppliers from, according to your book, from, Harvard, Yale, Boston, Atlanta, so we were really Corpses Are Us. So that was, interesting. I have to say that no book in my lifetime for 47 years affected me like Antero's book. 47 years ago, I had a very wild brother-in-law, and I was very pregnant with my first child, and he knew I couldn't go to sleep unless I was reading. And he gave me QB7 to read, which is by Leon Uris, and it detailed horrible but true experiments that the Nazis did on women during very gynecological, very cruel, no anesthesia. And so reading your book and coming across such incredibly detailed truth of what happened, the fact that so many people suffered in this city so much, and then you provide the addresses, you give such graphic detail about what went on. And also, I thought I was, not dumb, but I never knew that the Emancipation Act did not apply to anything but the Confederate States. So Maryland, which had stayed Switzerland for very monetary reasons, they didn't want to mess up their B&O railroad connections with the North. It is absolutely, like, I kept on thinking, the Ghost of Johns Hopkins, this is a haunted city almost, that we almost have to do like a prayer and cleansing. So that said, let's go back to the time. In 1950, Baltimore was the third largest city in America with 950,000 plus people. And how could it be that in the time that the world population has nearly tripled, that we just lost 5,600 more people who were paying taxes and living here left the city just last year? So we're down to the very, very lowest 600,000. There's a lot, because frankly, wouldn't you rather live where there's a harbor and a symphony and a zoo than live in Rockville, Like, why are the other towns in Maryland keep on growing and growing? So it's always been unusual, like, doesn't make sense. And reading this book, I understood more about what are the true conditions that have been in play. We were called Mob Town for 100 years, since the revolutionary days, and I thought that was, I've always loved kind of that we've been called number one in VD, number one in murder at times. As in the words of John Waters, he always says, at least you can get a date here, But what we have to understand is that it wasn't like, oh, those were the times and that's the way it was. 6 years ago, with the research of Philip Merrill, we had the privilege of presenting a story where we called it Medical Camelot. And it was actually 4 years before Hopkins opened its doors. In 1885, 2 African-American physicians opened a hospital not far from here that also had a medical school, and most of their staff were white European trained medical people who came. And there's a lot more that you could learn about Dr. George Whittington Kennard, Kennard. But what you have to know, that he not only prospered his hospital / church / pharmaceutical producer place as well, and medical school, but when he died in 1929, the Afro-American gave this account. With his Masonic apron upon him, a smile upon his face, Dr. Kennard presented a picture of one more in peaceful slumber than in cold death. By his casket from 9 in the morning until 1 o'clock, white, black, Gentile, Jew, wobbling old men and women, children hardly able to see above the rim of the casket, passed by and gave a last look at this man who had healed the sick and administered to their religious needs for 3 decades. Because it was not only the African Americans that had this separate and unequal treatment that was not envisioned, as you were saying, by by Johns Hopkins, but they really weren't so fond of Jews, Italians, and the Irish. So what is very sad was that Dr. Kennard's hospital was closed down by the Flexner Report, which closed about a dozen African American hospitals in America, particularly a beloved one in North Carolina called the Leonard Hospital. And it really, again, was such a blow. They began to have their own. So all of us, I assume most of us live in Baltimore or work here or invested in here. And what I would really love to see is, much like Brown University undertook, for the health and the dignity of the community, and especially of Johns Hopkins, which is such a remarkable institution in so many ways. If we were to undertake a truth and reconciliation process, and you've already laid such a groundwork, I think it would be so healing to hear from everyone and to find a way where we can be honest in what has gone on that was not right and go forth together stronger than ever. Many people ask me in my capacity as, time up, what I thought was the most absolutely creative thing I ever came across, and they think it's going to be a work of art. And for me, it's the truth and reconciliation process. So thank you, and bravo. Please buy the book. It's important.
Thank you, Rebecca. Before we move on to Ron Peterson, do we have cards around here? Do we have the cards? Or do we have cards? Okay, good. Just wanted to make sure. Feel free to write questions, and we're going to try to address some of those questions. I'm sorry. You can go.
Thank you. Let me begin by suggesting that there is absolutely no question that an understanding of the history of the Baltimore region going back to the early 1800s, intertwined with the biography of Mr. Hopkins, does help one understand Baltimore and Johns Hopkins medical institutions today, as well as the interplay between JHMI and the community. Now, Baltimore is a city of neighborhoods, as was pointed out by the author, with ethnic and racial origins that can be traced back all the way to the time that Baltimore served as a major port city for the entire mid-Atlantic region, with people and goods coming in from all over this world. And I agree with the author's notion that neighborhoods in Baltimore have really developed as living organisms, evolving over time as a function of economic and social and political forces. This process started in the early 1800s, has continued to this day, with patterns of strivers escaping impoverished areas only to be replaced by those of lesser means. Although born in a section of the state of Maryland that was quite dependent on slave labor, as was stated by the author, Mr. Hopkins did become an abolitionist, supported President Lincoln during the Civil War, whereas some of his business partners, including members of the Garrett family, were sympathizers with the South, exemplifying the house-divided nature of Baltimore City and the state of Maryland during this time. An understanding of this unique aspect of Baltimore's history helps the reader gain perspective on the behavior and actions of certain institutional and political leaders many, many years later. Mr. Hopkins' life experiences, including a serious bout of illness, his frustration with the poor care rendered at the Maryland Hospital for the Insane, on whose advisory board he sat, and the lack of access to hospital care for blacks in Baltimore all influenced his ultimate philanthropic direction. His decision to support the co-location of a university-based medical school with a world-class hospital provided the potential to create a synergistic effect for the benefit of humankind. Johns Hopkins institutions have remained in many respects a center of excellence within a city for which achievement of its potential has remained elusive. Mr. Hopkins' decision to support the development of a world-class hospital that would indeed be accessible to all in need of healthcare services, irrespective of color, religion, or ability to pay, created hope for the hopeless. And that beacon of hope remains today, although it is ironic for me that in certain circles within the inner city, skepticism still exists about the true intentions of those who work within those hallowed halls. But one only has to read the chapter on grave robbers to appreciate the origins of some of that skepticism. Racial dynamics of modern Baltimore are indeed informed by history. Now, some of you in the audience may know that I'm a stickler for detail. And so one of the lessons learned for me in this book is that even with an author as accomplished as this gentleman, there are a number of facts that are somewhat distorted. I've been associated with Hopkins for 50 years, 45 of which I served within the Johns Hopkins Medical Institutions, the last couple of decades in leadership positions. Page 212, the author suggests that the incompetence evidenced itself as soon as Hopkins built a 150-room Sheraton Inn across the hospital on Broadway in 1960, entirely financed from the hospital endowment. Operated by Hopkins, it grew as a reputation as the city's worst hotel. Now, the real story is that the university and hospital jointly financed the development west of Broadway beginning in the late 1950s and entered into an operating agreement with Sheraton Inn Corporation of America to run the hotel. About 13 or 14 years into that agreement, after we became totally frustrated with rodent infestation and hookers running rampant, Hopkins stepped in and took over. And initially, we ran the hotel through a third-party arrangement with another operator and then through one of our wholly owned subsidiaries. On page 197, the author suggests that patients were diverted to Good Sam Hospital, a Hopkins-run Catholic facility built in 1968. Well, the truth is Hopkins never ran Good Samaritan Hospital. Hell, if we had done that, history would have not had Good Sam going with MedStar. When it opened, Mother Saint Urban, president of the Congregation of Sisters of Bon Secours, ran the hospital. Then, in '73, the first lay CEO, Jim Oakey, who served for 2 decades, after which there was a succession of leaders, ran the hospital. Truth be known, Hopkins did supply physicians early on, and that is perhaps why it was suggested that we ran it, but we didn't. We also constructed, as many of you know, 2 towers at the south end of the campus in 2012. The author suggested that Abu Dhabi was present in East Baltimore, where the Heart and Vascular Institute's $1.1 billion Sheikh Zayed Critical Care Tower on Orleans had 560 beds and 33 operating rooms. We did construct 2 towers, not one, for a total cost of $1.1 billion. A children's hospital named after the mom of Mayor Bloomberg, and the adult tower named after the first president of the UAE for whom we provided care. So be careful what you read, but having said that, in my view, the Ghosts of Johns Hopkins, the fact that there were some misstatements does not take away the brilliance of the author's effort to weave together a biography of one of the most influential men in the history of this city with a portrayal of how the institutions he created have played such a role in shaping race relations over time. And I think that's one of the important takeaways. Now, the author does a commendable job in demonstrating the significance of the breakdown in trust of institutions within the city among poor inner city residents, particularly African Americans. And this breakdown in trust, whether involving the police department, Baltimore City school system, housing department, or even Johns Hopkins medical institutions, has occurred over many, many decades of time and for a myriad of complex reasons. At the heart of this is the fundamental belief that these institutions have failed to address basic needs, whether because of real or perceived incompetence, corruption, self-dealing, or indifference. Within the Johns Hopkins medical institutions, and I'll be done in 1 minute, I believe most of my colleagues feel as though we do a very good job responding to healthcare needs of the community when individuals present on our doorstep with a problem that needs to be addressed. But if we are serious about making stronger bonds with the community, the issue of trust must be readdressed. we must recognize once and for all, responding as we do very well to the presence of disease, this is not enough. Given our commitment to be here smack dab in the middle of the inner city, we must continue to pursue meaningful measures through partnerships with other entities to address fundamental needs that can influence the health and well-being of our neighbors. We cannot possibly do it alone, but we must be a player in shaping the improvement of the educational opportunities, developing more effective preventive health interventions, promoting job readiness training, supporting skills enhancement training, and job creation. And we must continue to bang away at the need for improving the safety of our neighborhoods for the sake of our neighbors as well as ourselves. And we must demonstrate that our interests are for the sake of our neighbors as well as ourselves, so that self-interest cannot be the sole motivation for what it is we do, whether through the approach to community-based research or physical redevelopment in and around the campus. We must do a better job demonstrating that we are directly interested in improving opportunities for our neighbors. Too much is at stake to be complacent. Status quo is simply no longer acceptable, and just as we must not accept status quo, our elected officials in Baltimore must strive to break away from the tradition of indifference referenced by the author. Thank you.
I have the dubious task of coming behind him. I would like to say that, Antero, I was very, very excited about your first book. My first time ever meeting you, not in my neighborhood, gave me a perspective. One who has lived, was born here and lived here for 63 years of my life. 3 years ago, I did not know the things that were written in your book until you wrote the book. I was happy then, and I'm happier today that you are challenging us to look into your book as a mirror to the past, and also looking at ourselves at this present time. It gave me an opportunity to understand what redlining was, and the neighborhoods where we lived were more than just neighborhoods that we lived in, but it also allowed me to understand that this city has always been controlled by those that hold the gold, and those of us that live there at some time or another had been those that kept the master's house and are still in some ways trying to use the master's tools, but we can only use them but so far because they are not working. Hence, to answer the question of Baltimore in the 1800s and Johns Hopkins and where we are today, my statement is thus: Baltimore in the 1800s, as well as today, lives in a contentious dichotomy between oppression and transformation. Hopkins, a Quaker, understanding the oppressive and prejudiced culture of not only the city of Baltimore, but the nation at that time, was an innovator in building up a place of healthcare and education that welcomed minorities, women, and other oppressed entities in the city. His vision was to provide excellent care despite race, religion, and gender, and yet he was still surrounded by people that didn't always share his vision. Religion didn't share his vision, religion, or commitment, and yet Baltimore still lives in this dichotomy between those who want change and those who perpetrate the hatred for others that Hopkins attempted to stand against. We have learned that one man cannot work for change on his own, and so therefore we continue to gather in protest in education, in public forums, and the like, to break the dichotomy and move towards transformation, of which he left in his will and testament that was not adequately adhered to from that time until this time. So listening and responding timely and appropriately to the voices of people is the key at this hour to move us back into the place of the wishes of Johns Hopkins. Their values and cultures should be respected. We need to be acutely sensitive and aware that the lack of respect is the same as enslavement. It just appears differently. It also continues to be an act of violence that is perpetrated in ways such as inequities in healthcare, jobs, affordable, decent housing, and too much attention being paid to the bottom line rather than the needs of the people. No one should have to come and listen to the provider actually state to them that this is what you need to do, or this one more drink would kill you, because that was not the way. He actually wanted us to be treated as whole persons, not half persons. He wanted us to be seen for our brilliance that he knew about and experienced because of the people that care for his home and a part of his business. So in so doing, I would say that the book tells the stinging truth, even though I cannot refute, as I have not had 50 years of experience at Johns Hopkins, in a manner that provokes us to look forward to, look in the mirror to see what character are we portraying. Do we have the heart of Johns Hopkins, or do we have the mindset of his peers and his religion, where silence was thought to be action, where in actuality silence was an endorsement? While I am passionate about this, since we are speaking truth today, we must take a look at whether we have been following a man for way too long or not following after the God that we need to ask for his voice at this hour, who gives us a clear sky and a clear view. I support that we should buy and read this book and research where there might not be truths and where there are truths, and get back to adhering to the will of Johns Hopkins.
I've got to follow that. Great. Okay, well, one of the things that I'm happy that this book does is it opens up a conversation about philanthropic giving. I think just at the weekend we all heard about Mike Bloomberg's big gift to for financial aid to the university, despite the fact that we see many stark indicators of need in the communities around us here. It's still big philanthropy's big compulsion to create and maintain elite institutions and keep them alive and well when they could be doing other things with $1.8 billion. And so I think one of the important things that Antero brings up is what we do with these gifts, what things are attached to them, and what kinds of influence they buy. And it's indicative that the gift of Johns Hopkins in his will wasn't without dispute, and it wasn't without, not everybody thought that Johns Hopkins, particularly located in this particular area around what we now know as a medical campus, thought it was an unalloyed good. So thank you for opening up those kinds of conversations in an institution like this. Another thing I'd want to say is that, at least where the hospital and the School of Medicine is concerned, it isn't enough to be proud that Johns Hopkins' original intention was to serve the local population, regardless of skin colour, nor is it enough to be proud of the fact that an orphan asylum for black children was part of the Hopkins bequest. Too much has happened since then that not only blemishes Hopkins' record, but routinely exposes it as a white supremacist institution. So it isn't enough to say that Johns Hopkins may have behaved badly in the past, but everything's okay now. That's all in the past. Okay, we could say William Welch, as Antero discusses in his book, the founder of the medical school and the founder of this school, or one of the founders of the medical school and the founder of this school, was a eugenicist. But hey, wasn't everybody back then a eugenicist? Weren't all progressives eugenicists? Possibly. Also, Hopkins has done many wonderful things, as we all know. And these might be the case. But to say these things is to ignore the fact that history is always about choices. It's about choices about who to listen to, and it's about choices that get made and who gets to make them. So I'm also going to quote from the Afro-American newspaper, who said in 1930 on the occasion of William Welch's 80th birthday, "With all the experience and experiments of Dr. Welch and his world-famous pupils with germs, none of them has discovered the microbe of race prejudice. And this is the more unusual because there are more of these germs at Hopkins than at any other similar university in the country. To be sure, other Negro-hating medical schools exist in the South, but they haven't the wealth nor the intelligence of Hopkins." To Baltimore, the Afro-American went on, "Johns Hopkins University and Hospital have been a model. Give Dr. Welch credit for building the medical school, and he must likewise assume the responsibility for the race prejudice and lack of toleration there." So, there we were, and here we are. Hopkins can behave towards its hometown by making choices that put social justice at the centre of its activities, not choices that mean that it only granted admitting privileges to an African American physician until 1966, that it didn't graduate its first medical student until the same decade, choices that don't include Henrietta Lacks, the Kennedy Krieger lead paint study, the forced displacement of local residents in the area just to north of this building, a private police force, or even by giving its students hundreds of dollars worth of lift rides every single month, and yet not offering to pay for them for a mass transit card to travel around Baltimore. Decisions that turn them further away from the city in which they live, rather than towards the city in which they live. So Hopkins makes these choices, and these are the things it does, but it makes these choices because of what it is. And to make those choices be choices that are rooted in social justice, Hopkins has to change what it is. Here's one example. Antero mentions in his book that in the early years, membership of the Board of Trustees of the university and the hospital overlapped. 10 out of 12 of the original trustees served on both boards. Boards of trustees hold power and they make key decisions. The last time I looked a couple of years ago, of the School of Medicine's Board of Trustees, 50 members, 4 were not white. Sorry, four were not white. Just 4 in a majority black city. Hopkins has to change, and until it does that from within, the kinds of distrust that Ron spoke about are going to continue. And I'm really glad that Antero's book lays out all those sores for all of us to read about and to think about, and hopefully to make better decisions in the future. Thank you.
All right, we're going to open it up for a few questions. There are a few cards out there, and if you have a question, please feel free to write a question. I know we already have a few, but feel free to write a question, and then I will try to read your question out loud. But we do have one question, and the first question is, please speak specifically to the mistrust of Baltimoreans with the Johns Hopkins institution. What is the hospital guilty of doing? Honestly, what are they guilty of doing?
As I write in the chapter about grave robberies and black mistrust toward medicine, Hopkins has been carrying this historic burden that is shared by the University of Maryland. In both cases, if you talk to old-timers, they remember how people were warning them in their childhood that unless you get home by the time the street lights come out, a Johns Hopkins doctor is going to grab you and cut you up. And so the distrust really comes from various sources, and one of the sources is that very few of the Baltimoreans living near Hopkins or the University of Maryland or any of the hospitals really understood what was going on behind those walls. And so there was this kind of suspicion that came from ignorance largely. But at the same time, for several decades, from the 1820s until the 1890s, Baltimore was a center of grave robberies that supplied medical schools throughout much of the eastern portion of the United States with corpses. And it's kind of interesting that Johns Hopkins, the man, had nothing to do with any of this personally, but he was a major major stockholder of the B&O Railroad Company, which made the transportation of corpses possible. What happened was that our climatic situation here made it possible for robbers to dig graves in the wintertime. And so then these corpses, they were folded up into barrels that were filled with whiskey, and the barrels were transported by the B&O Railroad to the ultimate destination, where a medical school took the body, and the whiskey was sold to any takers as rotgut whiskey, as stiff drinks. So these are the kinds of things that have affected people's views about what's going on in hospitals. And so in that sense, Johns Hopkins is a victim of its own success in doing things like providing anatomical education.
One of the other things, and we all know this name very well, is Henrietta Lacks, who had cervical cancer and who did not know that she had eternal cells, and nor did Hopkins make her aware of it, and nor was her family understanding of why they kept coming back and testing them every so often. And so I think, to speak to that Hopkins has been addressing the issue of the Henrietta Lacks cells, the culture medium that has been used so many times over and over again. The question has been on the table as to who profited from that. It definitely was not her family, who fell into different bad situations in terms of substance use and abuse and the like. And they still have not really prospered from it, other than, I believe recently there were some things about school and possibly housing, but they actually lost a loved one who has actually, her cells have been used across the world to possibly save others and to diagnose others. And to say that there was no profit builds that mindset of a lack of trust and a lack of transparency. And those are the things that in our community, in the Black community, that we have listened to and heard about. We've heard about the men that were in prison for different crimes committed, that were transported in the dark of night as specimens for research and the like, that there was no IRB in place at the time, which eventually brought about the fact that there had to be an institutional review board. So these are the things that the community around Hopkins and across the city, not just Johns Hopkins has already been stated, but also the University of Maryland, that are also elicited in Antero's book, The Ghosts of Johns Hopkins. And so we need to make certain that these things are not fairy tales, but they're not just in his book, but they're in other parts of history books that sometimes we have become ahistorical about because we don't read history, but we do need to read and understand where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. I'm grateful to hope and believe that today that is no longer happening, and there are institutional review boards in place to make certain that that does not happen.
There's just a couple of things I'd say to that. It's not just what the hospital does do, it's what it can't and doesn't do. So thinking about a hospital like Hopkins or a med school, it's embedded in a certain kind of healthcare system that means that there's access to healthcare is restricted for the poorest people. And there's a lot of, when you fit that together with the kinds of distrust in the local neighbourhoods that people have with Hopkins, where the emergency department is the only place where some people can get primary care, that creates a level of not just distrust but dependence. And so holding that distrust and that dependence at the same time is deeply problematic, and it's something that needs to be resolved. And like I said, it's, Hopkins is as a major healthcare provider. I can hardly afford to go to Hopkins. Never mind, I've got a decent healthcare plan. It's incredibly difficult for local people to use the hospital on a routine basis if they don't have access to medical insurance. So one of the things that an institution like Hopkins should be doing is advocating for its local population in terms of accessibility to healthcare, in terms of accessibility to other forms of social work and other forms of benefits as well, that are, that it is able then to provide itself. And so in that way, it becomes way more integrated into the community when you have a local community who can actually afford to attend the hospital itself.
All right, I have another question. The question is, East Baltimore had a very strong African-American political base. What role did Hopkins play in the transformation and the removal of people to allow Hopkins to expand?
Well, in the book, I talk about the political base and how that operated. The political base in my book is the East Side Democratic Organization, which came out of a split in a white organization, Mount Royal Democratic Club, that then led to a walkout by a dozen members over questions such as the war in Vietnam and guns. And so two organizations then emerged from that split. One of them was the New Democratic Club that produced politicians like Mary Pat Clark and many other reform politicians. And then the East Side Democratic Organization, whose leaders were Senator Bob Douglas and Dew Burns, who became the first African-American mayor, appointed mayor, when Schaefer went to Annapolis. So in my book, I also talk about the role of the political organization in failing to do things that it promised to do. The East Side Democratic Organization was guilty of not producing, and I detail all that, so that when we come to the blame in the failure of East Baltimore to renew itself over the years, there were two major players that shared the blame. There was Johns Hopkins, whose relationship with the neighborhood always had been difficult. It had been difficult when the neighborhood was white. It was difficult when the neighborhood became African American. And then there was the East Side Democratic Organization, which really mastered the art of using go-betweens in receiving federal money for semi-political purposes, even when that kind of federal money could not be distributed directly to political organizations. So I'm interested in seeing what is happening today, and one of the things that I point out in the book is that hospitals like Hopkins is no longer in hospitality industry. I mean, in hospital industry. They are also in hospitality industry, competing for patients. And so the surroundings, the larger community, become very important in determining whether a hospital is appealing to the customer base. And that, as I pointed out, was one of the reasons that led to the soul searching by Hopkins in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when there was talk about possibly moving out to East Baltimore altogether. Thank you.
It might be noted, by the way, that other hospitals, of course, that had been here over many decades of time did make the decision to depart and to go on to so-called greener pastures in the suburbs. Johns Hopkins trustees in the late 60s, as the author has appropriately pointed out, made the decision to stay for several reasons. One of the most compelling was the genuine belief that to be consistent with the adherence to the desires of the founding father, that there continued to be a need to have a physical presence here to maintain the care of those for whom Mr. Hopkins had stipulated in his will. The second thing was that there was a commitment to keep the medical school and the hospital co-located because of the interdependency that had been developed, but also it was the desire of the founding father to have a first-class school, university-based school of medicine aligned with the hospital. So the hospital trustees could not make a decision to leave without a determination to pick up everything. And so the third issue, practical matter, was the total expense to do so would have been enormous. But for all those reasons, the important decision was made around 1970 to stay when Sinai had gone on, GBMC was in the process, and so forth. And so we remain committed to being here. And the other thing that was done, and going back to one of the other questions, I would like to point this out, is that efforts were made starting in the late 60s, early 70s to develop alternative ways to address the needs of the local population with the advent of Medicaid in the late 1960s. That created the wherewithal to provide a means of financing health care for more persons who prior to that time had not been able to access health care, and working with the local community leadership. One of the very first Medicaid HMOs was created in East Baltimore, and that was done with the concept of creating primary care sites outside of the hospital to try to avoid the problem of persons being dependent on coming into the emergency department to seek that care.
All right, another question. Would it not be best that Hopkins just openly admit that it likes what it is, and it is just too bad they have to be and act elitist in Baltimore?
Could you just repeat that again? No, seriously, could you repeat the question again? Sorry.
So the question is, would it not be best that Hopkins just openly admit that it likes what it is, and it is just too bad they have to be and act elitist in Baltimore?
I'll let Antero answer that.
My view, after having interacted with a lot of world-class faculty over the 4.5 decades that I've been associated with the medical institutions, is that we do indeed have some of those brilliant people that could be assembled in one location who are doing some very, very meaningful work, but the majority of those people who are clinical faculty are also giving their time and attention to caring for patients, and many of those patients are from the community. And so if there is an elitism associated with the excellence in the academic world in which they are operating, that's something that is maybe goes along with the whole shtick, but I don't think that there is a situation in which people are failing to carry out their responsibilities to care for people, but at the same time, they are, there's no question that they're doing some very extraordinary, innovative research, and I think some people associate that with sometimes with elitism for whatever the reason. That's my personal view.
I really stumbled when I heard the word elitism, but I thought we could look at it from a different perspective than the community. It's my understanding that the employees of Johns Hopkins are paid less than the median hospital worker of the other hospitals in Baltimore. And part of that is because, well, with a background of working at Hopkins, you can kind of go anywhere. There is that sense of excellence, which is well-deserved on one level, but, excuse me, it even applies to people who work here. And why I was saying that I felt that the institution and the community could heal by a truthful process is because the wounds are still very, very fresh and in some cases ongoing in terms of displacement in this neighborhood, in the expansion of the physical facilities of Hopkins. But also, my dear friend, Rashida Turner Bay, she was saying that in her own family, her grandmother was very light-skinned and could pass for white, but she went into labor, and they rushed her in, and they assumed she was white. And word got out to the father that his wife was in labor, and even though the baby was just coming, her own mother, when they realized, oh my gosh, this is not a white person and she's delivering in the white ward, they made with a gurney to make her go right in the middle of delivery. So for many people, these aren't stories from 60 years ago or whatever. They're much more fresh. And I think that it's a big testimony to how much interest there is by looking out at the crowd today. And I just think that because Hopkins is a major, major power, that it's incumbent upon all of us to take whatever happens today and your excellent book and to go forward, not to muck up and to throw blame, but in the collective desire to be better than whatever it has been in the past. And to Reverend's comment, you can't, we all learned from Hopkins that you can't govern from the grave, I'm an old gal now, I don't know what will happen to the visionary, I think I've put a lot of the DNA in the right direction, but you can see the 16 years from his Christmas Eve death to the manifestation, whoever was there, a Gilman in his influence on the Gilman School was very, very elitist in the negative sense.
I'd like to respond this way, that over the last 10 years that I've been very, very closely associated in different departments and different positions in terms of acting as a community co-chair with the Community University Collaborating Council, as well as the co-chair of Johns Hopkins Center for Health Equity, as well as the now community co-chair for the Patient Family Advisory Council, that I have come in contact with Hopkins leadership different from being elitist, but desirous of having a heart to hear community. And I believe that when I first got started with talking and speaking with Dr. Blum, that those were the things that the Urban Health Institute began to try to pull together the community for the community's voice, to assess the community, to show the community how to assess itself, and also open the doors to bring provosts around the table for the first time in the development of what became known as the Johns Hopkins Community Health Improvement Program, sponsored through CMS. And so I would like to say that the community is now, our community, Baltimore City, that is being bandied about as murder capital of the nation, is actually under some awesome transformation, and that there is a percentage of people and violence going on in our neighborhood that makes us look worse than what we are. And we have a responsibility at this hour, being black and white, to come to a table and not continue to throw darts, but actually use our voice and our listening to began to be a part of that transformation. Sisters Together in Reaching has been a partnership with Hopkins over the last 7 years of 2 grants. We are in our second grant period with Johns Hopkins to hire from the community health workers, train them, as well as to work in our communities in the various zip codes to make certain that people that look like me, people that look like some of you, are able to be a part of interventions as well as resources and access those resources. And I think those are the things that we need to be aware of. I would say that if I had the knowledge and the background and the wherewithal, then I would open up my own Johns Hopkins. It would be Hickman's institution. And so therefore, I think that rather than throw out the word elitism, is look at have they changed? Are they trying to change? And are they trying to listen? And are they trying to be a part of the solution rather than a part of the problem? I think for me, what I have learned about Johns Hopkins is it knows how to do its business and do it well to keep on multiplying and growing, and we have to come in partnership to get a part of and be a part of building that foundation in our community, for our community, with our community, at the table being in partnership.
All right, I got several questions regarding East Baltimore development. And a lot more comments. So I'm wondering, can we speak a little bit on that? Some people were trying to say they're trying to say that there were some African-American families that left. What do we know? How do we make sense of it? How are we thinking about that? And how is it really impacting the communities?
Well, what I do in my book is I try to chart the ethnic transitions, rotations in East Baltimore. There has never been a book that does that about East Baltimore. There have been a couple of books that have done that about West Baltimore. But it is understanding those rotations, I think, is key to understanding the redevelopment choices that Hopkins has made and the necessity for redevelopment. What I do particularly, I talk about a community that nobody has talked about previously, and that was a community of Bohemians, Czechs in today's language, 10,000 of whom straddled Broadway, and that was a very politically powerful concentration of people. And so when we look at what happened to the area afterwards, we come to the conclusion that while lots of people talk about gentrification in the Hopkins area here as a threat, we really should not be so much talking about gentrification as regentrification, because many of the neighborhoods around Hopkins were not always poor, but they were thriving working communities. And so again, the trust issue is one of the main issues in this discussion about redeveloping East Baltimore. My take is this: if we do not want to gentrify or re-gentrify, what is the alternative? And in my mind, the only alternative is continued slumification. And we have had enough of that as a result of many of the national policies, lending policies, redlining, all that deprived the Hopkins neighborhoods here from reinvestment capital. And so if we want the hospital to thrive, we have to have a neighborhood that thrives as well. And so I truly see a possibility for great things happening here. I'm also looking, when I look at the Broadway area here, in my optimistic mind, I see a bridge forming on Preston Street and on some other streets that would link this area to Greenmount Avenue and Station North. And so there are things happening in this area that make me very positive about the future. But again, the trust issue is paramount in all this, in this discussion.
And so I would like to say this, and that East Baltimore has been undergoing major transformation relative to its housing. And Johns Hopkins has offered its employees an opportunity to give them money towards buying into the community. And in July, or August, I should say, August is when we had a community health festival, and we sought to invite all of those that we could find addresses for to come and be a part of that community health festival here at the Eager Street Park. And in listening to some of the people say, I'm not angry anymore about having been displaced, and others saying that they are very angry about being displaced and wondering why Hopkins did not open its doors to say, we will also offer you, those that are still living in homes that need to be refurbished, rebuilt, an opportunity to put monies there for them. There are those in community that are very upset that some of their children are not being allowed to attend Hopkins Henderson's school. I think that there is room to come, knock on the doors and say, we need to have a sit-down conversation as this development is taking place. Our community is feeling very much in a shift, and there's a lot of crime in the area. Crime brought about because people are seeking places where they can have decent, affordable housing, in which they find that the houses that are being built around them are not affordable for them with the income that they have coming in. These are real conversations with real people that we must ask that the trustees take a look into it, as well as if we're hiring from the community as community-based organizations, what are afforded to the community-based organizations employees to be able to move into the community with assistance financially to be able to support them being able to find their way in. And then East Baltimore lacks a lot in terms of things for our children to do. Recreational facilities. I look out and I see Ronald Miles. And as I look at Ronald Miles, he's been fighting for Chick Webb a very, very long time. A historical recreational facility that should have been a part and still should become a part of the restoration of this community. It meant something, and it still means something, as well as there are other facilities that can be utilized as recreational facilities that are just not there. They have to go too far out of the community to get to the UA Center. And so, therefore, what I'm saying is that I think there should be a meeting of the minds somewhere in the middle to hear the people that are still here that are having a problem with the transitioning away from East Baltimore or being displaced from their loved ones because they don't have the income to afford to be able to stay here with the transformation that is taking place.
All right, thank you. So,
Very, very quickly.
okay.
I don't think it's an either-or between gentrification and slumification. I think there are ways in which development can take place that doesn't involve displacement and doesn't involve the negative connotations of gentrification and the way in which it was performed in the East Baltimore area. And the other thing I would say is, and this isn't me saying this, it's a colleague at Morgan State, Lawrence Brown. He's termed it a form of colonisation, what Hopkins has done and EBDI has done. It goes in, it buys up forcibly property, it then populates an area with people who look like itself through things like Live Where You Work, and it changes the name of the place to Eager Park. That is colonisation in any other historical context. So I think what needs to happen here is for, yes, get back to this Hopkins admitting and being aware that this is what it's like, but just not doing it, just behaving in a way that Hopkins doesn't get to decide what the community is. It doesn't get to decide what a neighbourhood is. The people who live here should be doing that.
Excellent point. I want to ask the last question, and that's really related to hope. After reading the book and also this conversation, what hope do you see? What hope do you envision? So that's my question.
Well, there is hope and there are challenges. The things that are happening now around Broadway and things that are happening in neighborhoods around Bayview, they give me hope because this is what the city needs is rotation that rejuvenates communities. If you want to have a stable community, you need two things. You need constant rejuvenation of the population because that then improves housing and housing is up to date. But you also need access to conventional capital, and that is something that has historically been lacking from this area. And so that gives me hope. Now the challenges are very real as well. In my book, I talk about Hopkins' presence overseas. In Saudi Arabia alone, a Hopkins joint venture takes care of the health needs of 350,000 employees and dependents of the Aramco oil company. And so as a result of the political decisions that the president has made, Hopkins has been squeezed in its business model in that it is more difficult now for people from the Middle East to come to Baltimore. Hopkins' presence in the Middle East continues strong. I was in the United Arab Emirates, where 3 hospitals in Abu Dhabi are supervised by Hopkins. So there is hope, but there are lots of challenges, and so I'll leave it at that.
The humanitarian developer, James Rouse, said something very important and hopeful. He said cities were meant to be gardens in which to grow beautiful people. And if they're not good for people, they're not good at all. No matter what other industry or whatever might be growing, if it doesn't come down back to the people, it's not working. So as far as hope, we created at the Visionary Museum an exhibition called The Big Hope Show. And as part of that, I went down to Medellin, Colombia, that had been like the murder capital of the world, to look at how they had successfully, in just 10 years, went from murder capital to having less than a per capita rate of 1/2 of our current murder rate here in Baltimore. And the fact that it can be done, if cities were just going to get worse and worse and worse, then like the best thing you could do is leave, is to get out and start something someplace else. But there's so much great positive grassroots work and caring here that if you can make a difference in Baltimore, then you're one, fiercely creative, and secondly, how worthwhile. Medellin is much like Baltimore in that it had a very wealthy community, but it also had a fabulous hospital where the first successful kidney transplant took place. But then it had abject poverty. And what they did was unify in making it a city whose tagline was really lived upon, and that was everything, todo para la vida, everything for life, and that violence was inherently anti-life. And if it took 50 years, no, it took 10, and they've now maintained those strengths for more than 9 years. So I think that gives me hope.
I think to build upon that, there's no question that we have to address the safety issue in the city. We have to re-engineer the Baltimore City Police Department. We have to address the education crisis that we have. Baltimore City public school system is not serving our children well. We have to address the issue of affordable housing, and we have to continue the work at jobs creation, but we have to prepare people to enter or re-enter the workforce. That's some of the work that I've been engaged in over the last decade, particularly with those returning citizens that need to be reintroduced into the workplace. So in order to reestablish hope, at least I think about those 4 prongs.
I think to establish hope, we must establish or rebuild the public health trust, the medical trust. We must rebuild the trust with the researchers and the like, but I would like to ask my community, especially those that are here that I look around and see and call leaders, to be forward-focused and not past-possessed is what I hope you read the book and leave with, that we are a powerful people. We've been through a lot, and there's a song that resonated with me as I got ready this morning, and it's called the Corinthian Song. And when you get a chance, look up the song and listen to it, because for us as a people, we've been through a lot of storms, and we have actually lived through a lot of revelation, but we need to move beyond allowing anything, anyone, any place that we have been to keep us in a prison where we're constantly fighting yesterday and not living in today. But the song says, I am troubled, yet not distressed, perplexed, but not in despair, 'cause I'm a vessel full of power, with a treasure none can compare, persecuted but not forsaken, cast down but not destroyed. I'm a vessel full of power, within a treasure from the Lord. We are vessels in our communities, and we can do and make a change and make a difference. But we must know our history and live beyond our history and make an impact for those that are coming behind us. We have the power to protect our communities day and night by making certain that we are in collaboration with the Baltimore City Police Department, that we are working with the hospitals as well as the federally qualified health centers that are in our backyards. We have the responsibility to say, if you will not work with us, then we will work against you and shut down your bottom line. A lot of this has to do with making certain that we have healthy and well people in our communities, not slandering each other, but living to build and fortify a place, a community, a home for ourselves, for our children, and those generations to come. We have hope because we have power.
You've done it to me again.
You've been doing well.
I was only going to say, I've written it here, I see hope in resilience and power. And that's all it is.
All right. I would like to give Antero Pietila final remarks, if you want to say anything, brief remarks.
Well, thank you. There is no shortage of institutional histories of Johns Hopkins. And my book is not an institutional history. It is a social history of the city of Baltimore, a city that benefited very much from the life and career of Johns Hopkins. The starting point of my book is this. I believe that if anybody knows anything about Baltimore today, whether they are from here or from any other place, they are likely to know one or two things. They know where the Inner Harbor is located, and they know where the Hopkins Hospital is located. And so that's my starting point in telling the story of a city through one of the benefactors that contributed to the common good in this city, and also through the institutions, how they affected this city. And so what I hope to achieve with this book is, I'm not trying to assign blame to anybody. There's lots of blame to go around. What I want people to do is to start a discussion about this city. There are many things in my book that veer quite far off from the Hopkins focus. I talk about the historical roots of the police corruption, for instance, because that is one of the main things that we need to deal with in this city, where we have legitimized overtime cheating in the police department and in the Department of Public Works. So some of the things that I want to achieve through this book is, for instance, some kind of resolution about, on the political level, about a city that, despite frequent calls to alter its practices, still does not do routine audits of municipal departments. And these kinds of things have to change. We need to also realize that getting a job in Baltimore is a difficult situation, made even more difficult by the atrocious public transit system that we have. These are resolvable problems, and these are the kinds of discussions I want this book to trigger. Thank you so much.